In this video, we will look briefly at waves and particles from the perspective of quantum chemistry. According to the classical physics, this means more than 100 years ago, scientists thought that they have discovered everything at that time. This is the beginning of the 1900s and what they claimed about the waves and particles. Let's first talk about the waves. Interference of waves, both constructive and destructive, and related with the interference phenomena is diffraction from the surfaces of crystals, and in explaining all of these properties, the most important property of a wave is its wavelength. Lambda is the characteristic property. As you can see that when we discussed waves according to the classical ideas, there is no concept of where the wave is and where is the location of the wave. It's spread all over, and then there is no concept like counting how many waves there are, and now in sharp contrast to particles. So let's list the particles' major properties. Each particle has a mass like these balls. Here these balls are like particles and they have masses. Please note that there is no notion about the mass regarding waves. Other important property is well-defined position in space. Similarly, these balls here are all particles and they have well-defined position in space. In fact, it's believed at that time that it should be possible to measure the position of a particle exactly in space. A third important property of a particle is linear momentum. Linear momentum is a vector quantity. It is related to the velocity of the particle by this relation, the mass of the particle times the velocity of the particle. And related with the momentum, when we have more than one particle, let's say there are two different types of particle, one is a white balls and the other one is red balls. Two particles, the total momentum here, if you call one of them P1 and the linear momentum of the second one P2. This is the total momentum of the system. Now imagine these two particles collide and hit each other. After collision, their momentum change. If you call them the new momentum after collision P1 prime and P2 prime, there is a principle called conservation of momentum, linear momentum. It says that the total momentum before the collision is the same as the total after a collision. This is similar to the principle of conservation energy. The total energy before the total energy doesn't change. It is similar principle, but this time using the linear momentum. Another very interesting, actually obvious property of particle is that we can count them, like if you see these balls here. This is a simple obvious property, but it is important because it is not present over there according to the classical ideas for the waves. Now we come to the modern waves that emerge after the 1900s, in fact quite a short time. Actually between 1990 and 1950s, in 30 years, quite a new concepts have been developed. Of course, everything we claim is based upon experiments in science. Only if experimental observation, when you do some suitable experiment, if you observe something and if it is repeatable, then you can say that you have observed a certain property. So in this sense, experiments that have been performed for waves indicate that in addition to these properties, waves may have also some particle properties. And you will see on the following videos that waves could also have linear momentum. Similarly, experiments done using the particles have indicated that particles may also have wave properties. What is a major property? It is wavelength lambda. So it turns out particles could also be associated with wavelengths given a numerical value for wavelength. So let's discuss some of those. First, the properties that we are going to discuss arose from the experiments in which light is used together with some particles. In other words, interactions of light with the particles, and in this interaction energy can be transferred from the light to the particles. And also momentum can be transferred from light to the particles, and analyzing such experiments we can determine some additional properties. So let's look at the light according to the classical ideas. First of all, light is a form of energy that behaves like a wave. As any wave, light is characterized by a wavelength, and observations show that values of the wavelengths are infinite, and each different value of wavelength means a different type of light. If one analyzes the light which comes from the sun to the earth, some of them our eyes can see them. That part is called visible part. Lambda between 400 and 700 nanometers for lights which have wavelengths between this range 400 and 700 nanometer, human eyes can detect it, and to our eye each lambda value of light appears as a color. For example, where light with the wavelength 700 nanometer appears to the human eye as a red light. Light can be artificially generated or it can be obtained from the sunlight, and it turns out that in addition to these wavelengths, there are lights of wavelength smaller and smaller than 400 nanometers and also much longer than 700 nanometers. Therefore, this range of possibilities for the wavelength is called electromagnetic spectrum. When we examine all of it together, it's a very large range. Regardless of the wavelength of the light wave, it turns out experiments show that the speed of the light in vacuum in the empty space is the same for all wavelengths, and speed of the light is commonly denoted by the letter c, and this c is the amount to 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. So light with any wavelength travels in empty space in vacuum with the same speed, and as you know, whenever we have a wave, we also talk about the frequency of the wave. Frequency of the wave, Greek letters nu, and wavelength times frequency is the same for all kinds of light waves. This expression means that lambda and frequency are not independent. Therefore, to characterize a light wave, you may use either its wavelength or you may use its frequency. Because if you know the wavelength, these expressions tell you what the frequency is. Therefore, just one piece of information, either wavelength or frequency, is sufficient to characterize the light. Let's note the units also, the SI units, as it stands in standard international units. Meters, kilograms, seconds, these are the main units. Wavelength has distance units and SI unit is meter. Frequency has 1/second unit, and as you see from the expression, meter times 1 hour seconds means meter over seconds, meter per seconds, and that's the units of the C. Here's a sample of particles in a container. The particles here could be atoms or molecules or electrons or neutrons, anything, and this is a light wave or light beam. Experiments which are designed to study properties of the light. Waves are this type. We have a light source which produces a light beam, and then we have a sample, usually gas. In the gas phase, the container is filled with some particles. This light passes through the sample, and then there is a detector on the other side which analyzes what happens to the light wave. And by interpreting the results, one obtains information about both the particles in the containers, in the samples, and also some particles for the light wave. Now, when the beam passes through this sample, here it's found that energy exchange takes place from the light beam to the particles of the sample. The analysis, the interpretation of this energy transfer from the light beam to the particles in the sample indicates that we have to regard the light beam as a collection of tiny energy packets. So, these are the energy packets, each one assuming the light beam has a single frequency. Such a light is called monochromatic light, just one frequency, and each one of these energy packets is called a photon. There are many photons in the light beam. All of these photons move in the same direction, and the direction of the motion is the same as the direction of the light. If light is shining to the right, then the photons are traveling in the same direction. Each photon energy is directly proportional to the frequency of the light. The proportionality constant is commonly denoted by the H sample, so when you see this expression, you should imagine that frequency. If frequency is different, we have a different type of light. Light corresponding to all of the visible range from 400 to 700 nanometers as you change the wavelength, that means the corresponding frequency is also changing. Now the frequency can be different here, but this H is the same for all type of the light waves and the corresponding photon will have a different energy. As you see here, larger frequencies for the light means larger photon energies. For example, out of the visible range, the part of wavelength which is called microwave region, another part called infrared region. The wavelengths for the infrared are even longer than 700 nanometers. Frequencies are smaller than relative to the visible range. Microwave wavelengths are even longer than the infrared. That means their photon wave light frequencies are much smaller on the other side. We are examining the range of possible light waves using the frequency. Larger frequencies than the violet and are called ultraviolet or UV, so UV photons. If you look at this expression, UV photons means frequencies are larger than the visible light. UV photons have more energy than the visible light. If you look at the other infrared photons have smaller or larger energy than a visible light. Infrared photons have smaller frequencies, therefore their energies are also smaller than the visible light. Microwave photons are even smaller. So this result is very important since this energy is the energy of just one of these particles. Each one is a photon. The total energy that light carries is just because this is the monochromatic one frequency light energy, or one photon multiplied by the number of the photons in the beam. This picture is showing you that light waves have a particle property. Which particle property is that it is possible to count how many photons there are in the light beam. Normally, this countability is a particle property, but the result of such an experiment, which forces us that we have to treat light as a collection of photons, is telling us that light waves in such experiments in the energy transfer experiments have a particle property, which means it can be counted how many photons there are. In the following video, we will look at the energy number of the photons to the total energy carried by the light beam and cover the intensity. So before ending the video, let's remember what we talked today. First, we talked characteristic property of wave as a wavelength and its importance. Also, we mentioned that waves is the classical idea. Then we talk about the particles and their properties such as mass, well-defined position in the space, linear momentum and its countability. And then we talk about the relation between speed of the light, frequency and wavelength. If you wanna see more content like this, be sure hit the subscribe button. See you in the next time.